Today, we're gonna take some of our designs made in Photoshop and we're gonna bring them into After Effects just to add a little bit of subtle motion to them. If you are an experienced Photoshop user, you may not know that you're about 80 to 90% of the way there to get a file ready for animation, and that adding some subtle motion may be less work than you think. My name is Frank and I'm with School of Motion, and today we're going to be taking a look at how we can take some simple designs in Photoshop and take them into After Effects to add some animation. I want to teach you how an animator will think about choosing some images to bring into After Effects. And so there's a couple of very simple tricks that I want to show you to look out for in your images, so when you're selecting them, you have an easier time to be able to bring them into After Effects. And then also how you can do some very simple animation that would add just some life to that design, especially when you're posting for social media, where you want to have more than just a static design. You want to have something that's moving a little bit to catch the eye of your viewers. If you want to follow along with me, you can download the project files, which are going to be in the description below. And I'm also going to include the images that I've chosen from Unsplash so that you can work with them as well. Now, before we even jump into Photoshop or After Effects, I want to talk about the first step in making sure that we start this process out correctly, and that is to choose the right images. We want to be able to choose images that have a good contrast when it comes to the foreground and the background element. That's going to help us to be able to make the cutting out process easier. It's going to be able to hide a lot of our imperfections. Let's take a look at a couple of examples that I've chosen here that I think can work, and some of the things that you need to be mindful of once you start moving your images. I thought about this idea of it'd be cool to get like a skateboarder that is kind of, traveling through a street, and then we can, cut out that skateboarder and have the background move. So a lot of this is what you would end up doing in Photoshop anyways for your clients, where you have to take a subject out of the background. You have to create sort of a clean plate for it. And then you can put kind of your subject in another place, or put some text, or put a graphic element. This is sort of the same idea that we're going by here. Now, here's an image of a skateboarder that is, just on a very cool kind of white background. And, we see here that we have our background, which is our wall and our street. Then we have our subject, which is the skateboarder on the skateboard. And then we have the shadow, right? So once we look at this image, we say, okay, well, how can I make this image look like it's in motion? And there's a very simple trick in animation, and that is that when you want to make a subject move, you actually don't move the subject, you move the background. And so if the background is moving, it will look like the subject is in motion. And so this is exactly what we're going to do in this case. We're going to take the subject, we're going to separate it from the background, and then we're just going to have the background move really quickly and add some blur to it so that we hide some of our imperfections. It'll add some motion and life to our shot. So some of the things we have to look for when we're choosing these images is lighting. Lighting is going to be one of those tricky things that you have to be very mindful of, because you can start with an image that looks really cool and easy to separate, but there's a very distinct light in the image, or the light is coming from a certain direction, and when you start to cut out the image and you start to move the image around, the light is not going to follow. And so that is going to be more problematic for your viewers, as that's going to kind of kill the illusion. Let me show you another example where this makes sense. So take a look at this image of a plate on an orange background. If you notice, it's probably lit from the top and the light has been moved slightly to one side. So we see the shadow kind of on the side here. But if you notice, the plate itself, the white plate, is very well evenly lit. So I am looking for even lighting when it comes to the image and the subject that I have to cut out. Because if, for example, I want to spin this plate around, which is a very simple thing to do in After Effects, then I can just make a circular mask, cut it out and rotate it, and we'll just kind of add just some subtle motion so that it comes alive. Whereas if you have an example like this one, where you have an image of a plate that is very contrasted, when I try to spin this plate around, I'm going to have shadows on the wrong side of the image, and then I'm going to have to play around with the shadows, and then it's going to get much more complicated. So this is why it's important that you take a little bit of time and think about your concept, and you look at the lighting, look at the composition, and think about how you're going to animate this before you even bring it into Photoshop and before you even bring it into After Effects. Okay, so let's take a look at this example with the skateboarder. So I've brought my skateboarder into Photoshop and I've gone ahead and just masked out the skateboarder. And if you want to learn more tools on how to cut anything out of Photoshop, Joey actually made an amazing tutorial going through tools that I had not even used before and techniques that can help you in almost any situation whenever you need to cut out stuff. I'll leave a link in the description below because that is a very helpful tutorial, even for an advanced Photoshop user. Okay, so I've brought my file inside Photoshop, and there's a few things that I've done in here that are, pretty typical things that you would do to an image like this. I've cut up my subject from the background and I have them here on their separate layer. I have the shadow also kind of on its separate layer, and I've cleaned that up. But there's one thing that I noticed about the background, and that is that, we have a lot of lines and the perspective is a little bit off. We have some rotation in the background. So one of the things that I want to do to the background is make sure that the edges are kind of matching, kind of a seamless tile. Now, it doesn't have to be perfect, but you're going to see why this makes a bit more sense once we're inside After Effects. But what we're essentially going to do is imagine that I take this layer and then I duplicate it, and then I'm going to have kind of the layer match up over here, and it's going to be kind of looping. Imagine I do this many times, and we're looping this layer over and over again. Except in After Effects, it's very easy to do. But this brings up a problem. When I put this image next to the other one, these edges don't match very well. The line here is kind of wonky. It's not in the same line as here. So if we kind of clean this up a little bit before we head on over to After Effects, we're going to be able to get a better just overall result. So let me undo all that, kind of get back to where we were. And so that's what I've done here. I just basically cleaned up my plate a little bit better by first rotating it, and then I also just kind of duplicated this side, which when I threw some basic guides, I noticed that this side was kind of conforming to the lines a little bit better than this side. So all I did was just kind of play with the perspective here and just basically take this side, match it up with this side. I'm just going to do Control E or Command E on a Mac to kind of merge those two. And now I have a plate that's looking a little bit better. Now, we have some problems here on the right. I'll get to that in a second. Because before I bring this into After Effects, there is something very important that you need to do. And that is that you need to look at your image size. Right now, if I go to my image size, I see that it's a whopping 7,662 by 3,912. Now, I don't need this image to be that big. For most of the things that I'm going to be doing for social media or just posting on the web, 1920 by 1080 is enough. Or if I need 4K, I can get 4K resolution. So it's always a better idea, if you know your final size, to bring it down before you come into After Effects. You can always do it after the fact, but with raster images, you're going to be slowing down your machine if you are getting an image that is too big to handle. So let's do something here. I'm actually going to start by not changing the image size. I'm going to start by changing the canvas size. And to do that, I just go to Image, go to Canvas Size. And what this is going to do, it's going to allow me to kind of change the canvas around without messing any of my pixels at the moment, so that then I can reframe the image and we can get rid of that right border. So let's pick something like 1920 by 1080. Again, you might be working on a vertical, so you have to make sure that this makes sense for your project. It's going to tell me that, there's some clipping because obviously my artwork is much bigger than my canvas size. So now I see that I have my artwork kind of outside all this. And, I can kind of come in here, grab everything and just resize it. Bring it to a size that is going to allow me to not see those edges on the side. I'm also looking for a cropping that is going to allow me to get a good seamless tile that we're going for here. Again, it's not going to be 100% perfect. I'm going to show you once we get into After Effects, we can put a little bit of motion blur in there, and that's going to kind of get rid of a lot of the imperfections in our background. That looks good enough. It looks like we have enough distance here. I can bring some guides and make this perfect, but I don't really need to. I'm going to hit enter. And now, my artwork is kind of looking the same on one side or the other. All right, so before we get into After Effects, we have a couple of more things that we need to do here in Photoshop to make sure we have everything ready. First of all, I'm going to just get rid of this older plate that I had. This is the plate that was, a bit rotated. If you see the one before and after, it's not perfect, but once it's moving fast, it'll be okay. So I'm going to get rid of this clean plate. We don't need it anymore. I'm going to rename this as my clean plate. Perfect. And now I have all my layers. There's one more thing I need to do. Because I have resized my canvas, but I didn't change my image size, I have some leftover pixels on the side here, and these pixels will get brought over into After Effects when we bring them in. And I actually don't want that. I want to be able to just have a perfect cropped image that just goes to the border of my 1920 by 1080 design. So the way that I do that, when I need to just kind of crop every single layer that's on my project to just a specific size and get rid of all the pixels that are there, I can come in here and kind of copy and paste and all that good stuff. But if you just go to your crop tool and then delete cropped pixels and just hit enter, that is going to actually crop everything that is outside your bounding box. So now I have a perfect background that I'm going to be able to loop inside of After Effects. Awesome. So I'm going to save this project, and it's always a good idea to save it with a name that indicates to you that this is going to After Effects. Now it's time to open After Effects. Now, actually, Kyle from School of Motion made a super helpful tutorial on all the details on how to import a file from Photoshop into After Effects. So if you want more details on this, go check out his tutorial. I'll put a link in the description below. Okay, so now I'm here in After Effects, and I have two very easy options to start my composition. For now, we're just going to start a new composition from footage. I'm going to select my skater, and I want to bring this in as composition retain layer sizes. I want to make sure that I keep my layer sizes the same, and I'm going to get what seems to be a duplicate of that same thing I just got asked. I'm going to leave it in composition retain layer sizes, and you're going to see that we have a skater comp. Now, I want to show you something. I have Photoshop still open, and I'm going to just kind of put these side by side. There's kind of the same thing happening. We have a viewport where we can see our assets or our image or whatever it is that we've imported. And then we have some panels, which, we have panels in Photoshop and any other of the Adobe software. And then we have our layer stack, right? Which is kind of like our layer stack here, except here our layer stack is a little bit different. It's kind of smaller. And you're going to notice that our layers also have options to tick down and kind of dig into some attributes that we can change. The biggest difference is that our layers have time. That means that our layers have a sequence attached to them over time. One more thing I want to show you is we have our eye switch inside Photoshop, which allows us to turn the layer on and off. We also have that eye switch inside After Effects, which allows us to turn the layer on and off. However, we also have a very useful switch, which is the solo. And that means that I can solo a layer and just see it by itself. If you can kind of think of this as very similar, you're going to notice that there are tools that, you have your pen tool, your type tool, pen tool, type tool. So there's a lot of overlap between these tools. All right. Just want to show you that to kind of ease you into going into After Effects and start thinking about what we're going to do with this motion. All right. So we're here in After Effects, and we have a few options and buttons that are probably going to seem a little bit confusing if this is the first time you open it, but we're not going to have to use a lot in what we're going to be doing today. After Effects is a super powerful tool. And right now we're just going to scratch the surface of very simple things that we can do with it. But if you want to take a deep dive and learn After Effects the right way from the beginning, check out School of Motion's After Effects Kickstart, which will show you how to use After Effects correctly from the beginning, but then also some basic animation principles that you can start applying to your animation right away. I'm going to, first of all, untick our original layer and I'm going to lock it. Here's my lock switch. I'm just going to lock it, put it away so that we don't mess with it. Cool. Now, one way that we can animate this is if I just grab, our skater and think about like, maybe he moves from left to right. That could be one way to animate this character. If I can just have my skater start here somewhere and then, kind of go through the screen and end there. But in this case, I think it'll be much more fun if we just kind of move the background layer altogether. There is an easy way to do this. I can grab the layer, go to Edit, Duplicate, make a copy of that layer, and then like slide that copy over. And so, kind of put it in there perfectly. And, we see some funkiness going on there. That's all right. Don't worry about it. And I can just kind of keep doing that over and over again. And I'll end up with like, 10, 20 copies of this layer. And it could take a while. So one effect that we can use to be able to duplicate our background over and over again without us having to copy and paste it is called motion tile. Now, if you go to your panel that says effects and presets and you tick on it, you can search for motion tile. And you can just grab this and you can drag and drop it directly on your layer. Now be careful, you don't want to drag it on your skateboarder, although that might give you some cool effects if you want to try that out. We're just going to drop it on our background for now. Now, the way this effect works is that we have an output width and an output height that is going to allow us to kind of make this layer wider as we continue to move our slider. So let me show you what happens if I put 200. So if I put 200 and I take my background layer and I move it, now you're going to notice that I have a little bit of layer on my right, and I also have a little bit of layer on my left. Now, notice what happens if I try to click on this. This actually isn't something that I can move or do anything with because the only thing I can move is the base layer. See that? So if you're clicking here and you can't click on it, well, that's because this is the only real layer and these are just duplicates that After Effects is just magically putting for you there. All right, so with this knowledge that we now have, if I start bumping this up to, let's say 500, and I move this over this way, and look at this, I keep moving it and I still have more layers. So imagine now, I take my base layer and I can move it all the way here and look at all that space that I have. If I move this back and forth, now it looks like our skater is moving through space. Now, we are going to have some issues with the floor, but we'll deal with that in a moment. All right, so let me go ahead and undo that and just put our base layer back in the middle. Now that we know what's happening with this effect, motion tile is basically tiling our layer over and over again. I'm going to go ahead and just give this a bit more with probably about 1,000. Now you don't want to overdo it, otherwise you can crash your computer if you bring this number too high, so just be mindful of that. One very important thing that I haven't done yet, make sure to save your work. So I'm going to save this, my After Effects file, and I'm calling this social media post. Okay, so now that I have my file saved, I need to find a way to be able to move my background and make sure that it moves over time. So let's say that we want this to last 5 seconds. How do we know how long this comp is? We have a timeline right here, very simple. We have a slider that starts at 0. If I look over here, I have a counter. And, it's giving me how many seconds I have on this comp. So this comp is about 14 seconds. Now, we can change this in a number of ways. The easiest way is to go to composition settings, and I can change how long this comp lasts. And I can also change something called the frame rate. For our purposes, we're probably going to be working within 24 frames per second. That just means that we have about 24 images per second, right, that is being shown. And we have more information on this in our After Effects Kickstart class if you want to learn, but 24 is going to work for most of the things that you want to do. Okay, I can also change the length of my comp here. Say I don't want it to be 15 seconds. I just want it to be 5 seconds. I'm going to come in here and put 0.5. All right, and then I'm going to hit OK. All right, so I have a 5-second comp, and now I need to move this background for a whole 5 seconds. So how do we do that? This is the easy, fun part. You tick down on the actual clean plate, and we're going to go to our transform properties, and we see our position properties. And we can change things like the position. All right, let me undo that. We can change things like the rotation. I guess if we wanted to make this like a Marvel Universe movie, we're not going to do that today. And we can change things like the opacity if we wanted to, take the background completely out. Cool. So right now we're only going to deal with the position. And what we're going to do is that we're going to go to the very beginning of our comp. We're going to put our playhead at the very beginning, and we're going to click this little stopwatch right here under position. We have a little stopwatch, and when we click on that, we create our first keyframe. And a keyframe is basically a placeholder that After Effects will have. It's an indicator of where this layer is in time. And any attribute that you keyframe will be maintained for that time frame. And then when you move forward in time, you can actually take your layer's position and move it. After Effects is going to interpolate or basically animate for you in between those two keyframes. So now when I move through my timeline, I see that my background is moving. To play this back, I'm just going to hit the space bar. And now we can see that we have some motion going on. Neat. Very cool. Now we can actually make it go a little bit faster. If I take my first keyframe, remember that I have some tiling also going on this side. So I can take advantage of the fact that I can even make this start way on the other side. So I can change my position and keep going this way until I have the very edge of that border. I'm going to keep going. If I click on the shift key, I'm going to be able to actually continue to scroll a bit faster. Okay, so somewhere around there. Now let's play back and see how fast he's going. Now he's going really fast. Cool, huh? All right, but I also want to be able to kind of hide a little bit of my imperfections. We have kind of a lot going on in terms of the perspective that is a bit wonky. So to do that, we're going to add motion blur. And motion blur is basically what happens when a camera captures an image and it's moving very fast. It's going to come out blurry on camera. So to do that, I'm going to hit this switch here, this motion blur, enable motion blur. And then I'm going to enable it for the layer that I want to add the motion blur to. So our subject is not moving. He's in the middle of the frame, so we don't need to add motion blur to him. So we're just going to add it to the background. And now look at what happens. Now we get this blur that is happening as our skater is going. And just like that, we just added some cool motion to a design where most of the hard lift was inside Photoshop. But, when we came into After Effects, we had everything ready to just be able to add some subtle animation. Now, one last thing, I mentioned the shadow. And if you notice, our shadow has a little bit of that line from the tile in there. So there's a couple of ways that I can clean that up. I can clean it up in Photoshop before I bring it in so that line is not there. Or I can actually create a very simple shadow inside of After Effects. And to do that, I can make a layer, new, solid. We might just want to make it black. Yeah, let's just make it black. And so basically we just created a black card. That's the size of our solid. And what I can do is just like in Photoshop, I can create a vector mask by clicking on my pen tool while I have my layer selected. I'm just going to create a little vector mask. It's not perfect right now. I can't even see what I'm doing or where it's going, but that's okay because, there it is. Once I close off the mask, my layer is going to be completely masked off. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to try to very roughly put in my mask where kind of it's supposed to go. And I'm going to move my points around. This should be very familiar to you if you've done masking inside Photoshop. It's the same thing. Yeah, somewhere around there. I really need to fix these points. All right, so it's not perfect. I'm just going to zoom in here. And I noticed that the mask gets a little bit thinner in the middle. Kind of tapers there. So something like that. And again, this is going to be moving very fast. So we're not going to get a perfect shadow, but you know, close enough. All right, so we'll have this little shape right there. And let's go ahead and put our shadow, our new shadow. I'm going to rename this by hitting spacebar and typing in shadow. And I'm going to untick my original shadow for a moment. And just like in Photoshop, I have blending modes. So if you don't see these blending modes, you might need to hit F4 on your keyboard to bring up your modes. All right. So I'm just going to switch this to multiply. And you have a lot of modes in there, just like in Photoshop, plus a few that are really neat. You should check them out. And I'm going to change the opacity of my layer by ticking down on the arrow, bringing down the transform, and bringing down the opacity. Okay, so I'm going to bring that up. But, you know, I really wish I didn't have that much of an edge like that. Well, guess what? In After Effects, you can actually change the feathering of a mask by opening the mask, taking down on the mask properties, and then changing the feathering of your mask. All right, so I'm just going to feather it out a little bit. And, you know, that shadow is not looking dark as the other one, so I'm going to bring back the opacity. Again, not perfect, but there's a little trick. I can duplicate my shadow by going to Edit, Duplicate, and that's going to make my shadow a little bit darker. Great, and now when I play this back, I have a looping animation. Cool, huh? All right, to export this, we're just going to go to File, Export, Add to Render Queue. And this is basically going to tell After Effects to take everything that we've done inside of our composition and just basically bake it down to one movie. Okay, so if I click here on the output module, I'm going to be able to see kind of some different formats that I can choose from. QuickTime is probably going to work the best for you in most of your situations. And then for format options, you may not need a very high resolution video. So I would recommend keeping it around Apple ProRes 422 if you have that option available for you. If not, Animation is going to give you an uncompressed kind of very high resolution video. It's going to be a little bit big, but that's okay because we can always create smaller versions later. So Animation is probably the one that most of you that are out there looking at will have access to if you're on a PC or on a Mac. So go ahead and hit Animation. And if you have audio for your clip, make sure that you have your audio on. I don't have any audio for this clip, so I'm just going to leave it off. And I'm going to hit OK. The final thing is I want to select where I'm going to put this movie. So output to, just click on the name, and I have a final renders folder. You can have a structure that makes sense for you, but it's kind of a nice idea to have a structure for you to know where your stuff is. So I have a final renders folder that I'm going to just save my skater and then just hit save and then hit the render button. We'll watch After Effects do its magic. And that's the sound that we want to hear. Now, sometimes you might get some error messages or just some things that have to do with metadata. You can just kind of ignore that. We don't really need that. Awesome. So you just made an animation. So if I go here to my final renders, I can see that I have my skater movie here. If I just preview that, yay, there's my skater. He's moving around. Cool. So this file is 252 megabytes, but it's also in a MOV codec, which, you know, might be a bit too big. So with your Adobe subscription, you have access to Adobe Media Encoder. Adobe Media Encoder allows you to quickly change from one format to another. And in this case, I'm going to change from an MOV to an H.264, which is just more common for the web. All right, so I'm going to drag and drop this into my Media Encoder. Easy peasy. And I already have H.264 selected here. If you don't see H.264, you can just click on here and you will see all these options. Just make sure you select H.264. Don't worry too much about all these other settings right here. That's kind of more complex. Just make sure you select H.264. Alternatively, you also have some presets here like for Vimeo and YouTube and all of that. If that makes sense to you, then that's probably a safer just bet for you to select those. But H.264 match source, high bitrate is usually the way to go. Hit OK, and then I'm going to hit the play button, and that's going to create a file that is much smaller. This one is 3.37 megabytes. This one is 252 megabytes. So now if I play this back, it still looks pretty nice, and I've got my video. I really hope that this was helpful so that you can start seeing that you can take some of those Photoshop designs and bring them into After Effects and start adding some subtle animation to them. If you want to learn more about how to become an animator, head to schoolofmotion.com, where we have courses and we have a ton of free resources that can get you started on the journey to becoming an animator.